As I do a breakdown of my lighting setup, I'll share 3 tips with you that have helped me go from beginner to advanced lighting setups. When it comes to cinematic lighting, the advice is typically to backlight your subject. And what that means is you place your subject between the camera and the main light source. And what this does is it helps produce a nice checkerboard effect of highlights and shadows throughout your frame, which helps to create depth, shape, and helps create different interesting pockets throughout your frame. Whereas if you were just to point the light directly at your subject from the same angle and location as your camera, you wouldn't have much variety in highlights and shadows. It would just be all highlights, and that would kind of take away from the 3-dimensional shape and depth and just interest of your frame. And that's why it's common advice to backlight. However, it's not the only cinematic lighting setup that you can use. As you can see here in this behind the scenes image from Dune, which had incredible cinematography, the light source is actually above the subject. So I knew I wanted the main light source to be above me, so I positioned the bike underneath the garage opener strip thing, and that gave me something to mount a light to. So I used this super clamp from Alanzi to mount a PavoTube above my head. I originally didn't have a grid on this, but then I decided to add a grid because it just helped focus all the light onto me, whereas before, without the grid, the entire room was lit up and it was kind of taking away from me as the focal point. One of my favorite things about the PavoTube is you can use it as a practical light. And if you don't know what that means, practicals are basically lights that you can see within your scene, whereas non-practicals are studio lights that you're gonna hide, and even though they are helping light your environment and your subjects, you're not actually letting the audience know that those lights are there. So that's tip number 1, is to actually invest less in studio lights and more in practical lights. So things that you can leave in your scene, things like lamps or things like tube lights, things that you can leave within your environment when you're shooting to help create more interesting images and to also light your subject in small spaces without the need to have to try to hide all these studio lights. Next, I knew on some of the close-ups and shots of my face that I wanted the typical cinematic lighting gradient across my face where it moves from highlight to shadow. And so I knew that I needed to light my face from the side in some way. But before I did that, I needed to have a reason or a justification for having that light there. So I added 2 PavoTube 6Cs to the rack on the left side of my face because I knew that I was going to be shooting on the right side of my face later on. Having a justification for a light in your scene is called motivated lighting, and that's tip number 2, is that whenever you want to place a light somewhere, you have to make sure that there's actually a reason for that light being there. Because if you just point a studio light at someone's face, you could have a wonderful studio light with a wonderful softbox, and the lighting could be beautifully soft across the face. But if the viewer doesn't understand where that light's coming from, it's going to feel super forced, and it makes us feel like we're on set rather than watching a story unfold. And when we haul a viewer out of the story like that, it takes away from the production value. And that's something I had to learn to take my setups from beginner to advanced. And that again adds on to tip number 1, which was to invest in practical lights that you can place in your scene. So if you know you want to light a subject a certain way or a space a certain way, you can first place those practicals throughout your environment, and then those give you the justification to help add more studio lights and have it feel natural. So I set up my second PavoTube 30X to help add to the light that was coming from the PavoTube 6Cs on the rack behind me. The larger a light source is, the softer the light, which is why a lot of softboxes come in extremely large sizes. But this can take up a lot of room and it can be expensive to invest in a lot of softboxes. So one of the tools that I use on almost every lighting setup now is I bounce my light off something. When you bounce your light off a larger surface, you're basically creating a larger light source and therefore softer lighting. Now, if you don't have a white object to bounce it off, I highly recommend just using a C-stand with a blanket or even buying a 5-in-1 reflector dish like I have. And the problem with not using a white surface is that if you're bouncing it off, let's say a slight green surface or a slight yellow surface, you start to get this tint in your light that's not the same color as the light source you're using, and it starts to make it feel unnatural again because we're trying to match the light with the light in the background. And that's tip number 3. When you're in tighter spaces, look for areas to bounce light off rather than trying to bring in softboxes and other equipment that can be extremely large and hard to hide in your scene. So to summarize everything we've talked about, these 3 tips really lead into each other. So tip number 1, Invest in practical lights because those are the things you're going to be seeing in your scene. So it's going to create more interesting images. It's going to help you light your subject in small spaces because you can leave them in the scene rather than needing to hide them. And then leading into tip 2, those practical lights give you a reason to use your studio lights without it feeling unnatural. So first, invest in practicals, things like lamps, things like tube lights, and find how you can place those throughout your scene in an interesting way. Then start investing in studio lights, which help to exaggerate and shape those practical lights. And finally, third, look for ways to bounce light in your scene so that you don't need to invest in massive softboxes and so that you can still keep a high quality cinematic image even when you're in a super tight space. If you have any questions, you can leave a comment below, you can message me on Instagram, TikTok, email me, whatever works best for you. I want to help out in any way that I can, and I really appreciate you for watching and supporting my channel.